Rena Wexler collapsed into Tavon's lap 5 minutes after the vote. The departure board smeared. Her fingers clenched his coat. Transit police moved fast. He whispered, "Count the light, not the noise," and her breathing steadied. But the collapse wasn't random. Security footage showed an oiled floor where her elevator opened at 6:12 a.m., and the word dizziness had been scripted in an internal email before she arrived. The whisper Tavon used? His dead wife Alana taught it to Rena 16 years ago during a bone marrow donation that saved her life. Alana's name now sits in a sealed Harborline compliance file. The crash that killed her? A report addendum reveals an unidentified vehicle pacing her before impact. Drop a comment where you're watching from and subscribe before someone you trust becomes a clean exit. Because Tavon is about to discover how many people die in accidents when they witness what corporations can't afford to explain. You don't get to call it dizziness, Rena. People don't lose consciousness 5 minutes after a closed-door vote. The accusation arrived low and sharp across the concourse at Baltimore Penn Station, calculated to sound private while carrying just far enough to leave a mark. And then Rena Wexler's heel caught a slick seam in the marble that didn't belong there. She didn't stumble the way someone trips over an uneven surface. She folded the way a body does when it's been waiting for permission to stop holding itself upright. The overhead departure board smeared into bright blocks of yellow and white. The chrome edge of the coffee kiosk flashed once in her peripheral vision, and Rena, CEO of Harborline Logistics, the woman whose name moved freight contracts along the Patapsco River like weather patterns, fell forward into the lap of a stranger sitting on a bench meant for tired commuters. His knees jolted under the sudden weight. Her cheek pressed against the fabric of a winter coat that smelled clean, like detergent and cold air, nothing expensive or deliberate about it. 2 transit police officers were already stepping in before anyone else could react, palms raised in that practiced gesture that forms a barrier without asking anyone's consent. And the first person to reach for Rena wasn't a friend or a colleague, but a man in a dark suit, with a Harborline security badge swinging from his neck like a pendulum marking time. "Don't touch her," someone warned from the gathered crowd, as if human hands were the real threat and not the story already being constructed around her collapse. The man whose lap she'd landed in didn't shove her away. He didn't freeze in panic, either. He leaned down close enough that only Rena could hear him and whispered, steady as a metronome ticking through silence, "Count the light, not the noise. One thing you can see. Hold it." Then the next. The station kept moving around them, passengers dragging luggage, announcements crackling overhead, the smell of burnt coffee and winter coats packed too close together. But Rena didn't move. Her fingers, clenched hard in the fabric at his thigh, loosened by a fraction like a fist remembering it had a choice. His name was Tavon Lau Rigsby, and he'd come into the city from Hallethorpe on the first MARC train that morning because it was the only way his life still fit together on weekdays. Early 30s, low-fade haircut, kept clean, no beard, the kind of man who looked like he could hold steady even when everything around him slipped, because he'd already learned what it cost a child when a parent couldn't. His daughter Nia was 8 years old, staying with his sister in Towson for the week, while he covered extra shifts at the distribution warehouse and tried to patch holes in a budget that hadn't recovered since the night his wife died. Tavon wasn't at the station looking for drama or meaning. He was there because routine kept grief from spreading into the parts of his life that still had to function. When the CEO dropped onto him, the concourse reacted as one organism. People craning forward to see, people stepping back to avoid involvement, eyes hungry for detail but cautious because authority had arrived too fast for this to be random. The paramedic who knelt beside Rena was there within seconds, not because miracles are common in train stations, but because Harborline Logistics had relationships with the kind of systems that prefer to stay smooth when money and reputation are involved. "Ma'am," the medic said, his voice practiced into a gentle register that didn't match the speed of his arrival. "Can you tell me your name?" Rena didn't answer him. She stared at Tavon instead, her breathing still thin but steadying, as if the whisper had dragged something up from a locked room she hadn't opened in years. "Where did you learn that?" she asked, and her voice came out raw in a way that made the question feel like an accusation of its own. "Subscribe before you miss the warning signs someone's already noticed." Tavon should have said he read it somewhere, or that he'd heard it in a waiting room once, something disposable and forgettable. But he had a habit of telling the truth when it mattered, even when the truth cost him something. "My wife," he said. She used to say it to patients. "St. Agnes Hospital. ICU nurse." The medic's eyes flicked sideways, taking that detail in with the kind of recognition that comes from working near trauma long enough to know the look that never leaves a spouse, even when the person does. Tavon didn't mention shock trauma. He didn't mention the wet stretch of Interstate 95 near Jessup, where another driver drifted over the center line one night and changed his family's shape permanently. He didn't mention how Nia had slept with the hallway light on for months afterward because darkness felt like a door closing. But Rena heard it anyway, the way grief recognizes grief across a crowded space the same way fire recognizes oxygen. Harborline's head of security tried to move between them, the instinctive corporate reflex to control the frame and manage the narrative before it could grow teeth. Rena lifted one hand, a small motion that carried absolute authority, and the security man obeyed without question. "I need to talk to you," she said to Tavon, her voice steadying with each word like someone rebuilding a structure from the foundation up, somewhere no one can record. Today, it wasn't a request dressed as politeness. It was an emergency wearing good posture and expensive shoes. Tavon's phone buzzed in his coat pocket, and he didn't even have to look at the screen to know it was Nia. Every promise in his life had turned into a weight he carried with both hands, measured in pickup times and bedtime routines, and the terror that one more failure would crack something in her that couldn't be repaired. He glanced down at the message anyway because ignoring his daughter wasn't something his body knew how to do. "Dad, you still coming for pickup?" The words sat there on the glowing screen, ordinary and devastating at the same time. Tavon stared at them long enough for guilt to turn physical in his chest. Then he looked back at the woman who had just been accused in public like someone wanted the accusation to echo, the woman whose collapse had been too precise to be random, and he saw something in her face that he recognized from the mirror on bad mornings. She wasn't asking for help. She was asking for a witness. "When?" he asked, and felt the ground shift under a decision he hadn't fully made yet. Rena's answer came fast, like she'd been holding her breath since the moment she hit his lap. 2 hours. I'll send the address." She pushed herself upright with the medic's help, her movements controlled now, deliberate, and when she glanced back at Tavon one more time before the security team closed around her like a wall, she said something that rearranged the entire morning into a shape he couldn't ignore. "You're not a stranger, Tavon," she said quietly, using his name even though he'd never given it to her. "Your wife made sure of that." They met 2 hours later in a rented conference room off Pratt Street, the kind of neutral corporate space that businesses use when they want conversations to exist without leaving permanent records. Beige walls, a framed print of the inner harbor that looked like it had been chosen by someone who'd never actually stood at the water's edge, and a table that had heard 100 quiet negotiations without keeping any of their secrets. Rena wore flat shoes now instead of heels. That detail mattered because it meant she expected to be here long enough for her feet to ache, long enough for the pretense of composure to become a physical cost she had to manage. She set a leather folder on the table but didn't open it immediately, her hands resting on top of it like she was holding something down that wanted to rise. "I didn't fall," she said, and the words came out simple and final, the way someone delivers a verdict they've already lived through. "I let myself go." Tavon's eyes narrowed, not with disbelief, but with the kind of careful attention that comes from having learned the difference between what people say and what they mean. Rena slid her phone across the table toward him without further preamble. The screen showed security footage from Harborline headquarters in Locust Point, timestamp marked at 6:12 that morning. Rena stepped out of a private elevator, her posture upright and controlled, her heels meeting the polished floor at the threshold where the elevator met the hallway. The next frame showed her right foot sliding forward on a glossy patch that caught the overhead lights differently than the surrounding marble, and then her body reacted before her face could register surprise. "They oiled the floor," Tavon said, and he hated how quickly his brain found the pattern, how easily the pieces arranged themselves into something deliberate. It wasn't a question. It was recognition. Rena nodded once, a small motion that carried the weight of someone who'd spent hours reviewing the same footage and arriving at the same cold conclusion. "My board voted to remove me this morning at 5:45, she said, her voice steady in the way that only comes from rehearsing the facts until they stop feeling like violence. The vote was unanimous. They needed me to look unstable in public afterward. Not incompetent, not criminal, just unstable enough that the optics would support their decision. It's cleaner that way. Easier to explain to shareholders and regulators. She pulled the phone back and swiped to another image. This one showing an internal email chain with timestamps that lined up too perfectly to be coincidence. The subject line read Narrative Coordination, Penn Station Deployment, and Tavon felt the room tilt slightly as he read the first 2 lines of preview text visible on the screen. They scripted the language before I even arrived at the station, Rena continued, her tone documentary flat, as if removing emotion would make the facts more manageable. The security director who rushed in after I collapsed, he called it dizziness before the paramedic even touched me. That word was chosen in advance. Tavon leaned back in his chair, the pieces clicking together with a precision that felt worse than chaos because chaos at least pretends to be random. He remembered the way the transit police had moved, the way Harborline security had formed a perimeter so fast it looked choreographed, the way the man in the dark suit had used language that sounded official without ever asking Rena a direct question about her condition. You chose the station, Tavon said slowly, working through the logic out loud. You knew they'd script it, so you went somewhere public. Rena's expression shifted, something close to respect flickering across her face before she locked it back down. Public places create witness noise, she said. Cameras everywhere, civilians recording on phones, transit police who file their own reports separate from corporate security. The board wanted a controlled narrative, and I disrupted it by collapsing in the one place they couldn't fully manage. Tavon understood then, with a clarity that felt like cold water, why she'd landed in his lap instead of folding onto the marble floor or catching herself against the bench. She hadn't been looking for help. She'd been looking for an anchor point that couldn't be categorized, someone outside the system who would complicate the story they were trying to write. You needed a human being, he said, not a corporate handler. Rena met his eyes without flinching. I needed someone who would say something real, she corrected. And you did. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of quiet that settles between people who've both learned that the world runs on scripts most people never see, and that the only defense against a script is to break its rhythm before it finishes writing you out. Tavon's phone buzzed again on the table between them. Another message from Nia. This one just a photo of her lunch tray at school with a caption that said they gave us the good pizza today. The ordinariness of it made his chest tighten because his daughter was eating cafeteria pizza and texting him pictures while he sat in a rented room learning that people engineer collapses the way other people engineer software. He looked up at Rena and asked the question that had been building since the moment she used his name at the station. How do you know who I am? Rena opened the folder then, finally, her fingers moving with the careful precision of someone handling evidence. She slid a single sheet of paper across the table, and Tavon saw his wife's name before he registered anything else on the page. Alana Jo Rigsby. The document was old, formatted in a way that predated modern design standards, and stamped with a header that read Harborline Logistics. Internal Compliance Review, sealed. Your wife's name appeared in one of our sealed files 2 weeks ago, Rena said. And her voice had gone quieter now, not softer, but more controlled, like she was managing the impact of each word. A nurse doesn't show up in corporate freight compliance unless she witnessed something that threatened someone's money. Tavon's hands went still on the table. His wife had been a nurse. His wife had been kind. His wife had been dead for 16 months. Don't do this, he said, and the warning came out sharper than he intended because he could feel how easy it would be for grief to become a weapon in someone else's hands, how quickly pain could be repackaged into a story that served purposes he didn't understand yet. Rena didn't push. She let the paper sit between them, present but not aggressive, and when she spoke again her tone had shifted into something that felt like honesty instead of strategy. I'm not asking you to trust me, she said. I'm asking you to decide whether you want to know why her name is in a file that shouldn't exist. Tavon stared at the document, at his wife's name printed in black ink on institutional letterhead, and he felt the ground shift under a question he hadn't known he needed to ask until this moment. Tavon left the conference room with Rena's question sitting in his chest like a stone, and he did what he always did when the world stopped making sense. He went to pick up his daughter. The drive from downtown Baltimore to Towson took 32 minutes in afternoon traffic, and he spent most of it trying to remember the last time Alana had mentioned Harborline Logistics or freight routes or anything corporate that would explain why her name lived in a sealed file. He came up empty. His wife had talked about patients and shift rotations and the small indignities of hospital bureaucracy, not shipping manifests. By the time he pulled into his sister's driveway, he'd convinced himself that Rena was wrong, that the name in the file was a coincidence or a clerical error, something explainable that didn't require him to rewrite 16 months of grief into something darker. Nia ran out to meet him before he'd even turned off the engine, her backpack bouncing against her shoulders, and she launched into a detailed account of her spelling test and the cafeteria pizza and how Ms. Calhoun let them have extra recess because nobody talked during silent reading. Tavon listened the way he always did, nodding in the right places, asking follow-up questions, letting her voice fill the car with ordinary life. He made dinner when they got home, spaghetti with Jared's sauce, garlic bread from the freezer, nothing that required real attention, and Nia sat at the kitchen table working through her math homework while he moved through the familiar rhythm of boiling water and setting plates. This was the routine. This was what kept them both functional. But when he went to drain the pasta, his hands stopped mid-motion, and he stared at the steam rising from the colander like it was trying to tell him something. He couldn't do it. He couldn't pretend the file didn't exist. After Nia went to bed, Tavon stood in the hallway outside his bedroom for a long time before he opened the door. Alana's things were still in the closet, boxed but not donated, a decision he'd been putting off because getting rid of her belongings felt like erasing proof she'd been real. He pulled down the largest box and carried it to the kitchen table, where the light was better and he could spread things out without feeling like he was performing archaeology on his own life. The first item he removed was her nursing bag, the canvas tote she'd carried to every shift, worn soft at the handles from years of use. He unzipped it slowly, not sure what he was looking for, but trusting that he'd recognize it when he saw it. Inside were the expected things: pins, hand sanitizer, a stethoscope she'd bought herself because the hospital-issued ones were terrible, a half-empty pack of gum. But tucked into the interior pocket, folded small and creased like it had been opened and refolded many times, was a parking pass for a clinic in Catonsville. The name on the pass was Baltimore County Family Health Center, and the expiration date was 3 years old. Tavon stared at it, and the memory came back sharp and specific. Alana telling him she had one more stop before coming home, her voice casual, her face turned away. He'd assumed errands, groceries or prescriptions, or the dry cleaning she always forgot to pick up. Now the parking pass suggested something else, something deliberate that she'd chosen not to explain. He set the pass aside and kept searching. Near the bottom of the bag, he found her old work calendar, the paper kind she'd used before switching to her phone, pages curled at the edges and marked with her neat handwriting. He flipped through months of shift schedules, noting the patterns he remembered: doubles on weekends, overnight coverage, the occasional requested day off for Nia's school events. But then he noticed dates marked with a small star in the margin, 6 of them spread across 4 months, and none of them corresponded with her hospital schedule. The stars were always on Tuesdays, always in the early evening, always unexplained. Tavon felt his pulse pick up because Alana had been methodical about tracking her time. If she'd marked something, it meant something. He pulled out his phone and opened the Photos app, scrolling back through old pictures until he found one from a Tuesday night marked with a star. The photo showed Nia at the dinner table, grinning at the camera with spaghetti sauce on her chin, and in the background, barely visible, was Alana's coat draped over a chair still damp from rain. She'd been out. She'd come home late, and she'd never mentioned where she'd been. Tavon set the phone down and pressed his palms against his eyes, trying to hold back the realization that was building like pressure behind his skull. His wife had lived a version of her life that he'd never seen, not because she was dishonest, but because she'd decided some things didn't need to be shared. The question was whether those things had gotten her killed. He tried to stop there. He tried to close the box and put it back in the closet and return to the routine that protected them both. But when he stood up from the table, he found himself staring at Nia's bedroom door, thinking about the way she still slept with the hallway light on, and he understood with sudden clarity that routine wasn't protection. Routine was a delay. If someone had hurt Alana deliberately, if her death wasn't random, then pretending everything was normal wouldn't keep Nia safe. It would just make them easier targets. The realization didn't come with panic. It came with a cold, settling certainty that rearranged his priorities in real time. Tavon sat back down at the table and did something he hadn't done since the funeral. He closed his eyes and whispered the phrase Alana had taught strangers, the phrase he'd given to Rena in the train station without understanding its weight. "Count the light, not the noise," he said quietly, his voice rough in the empty kitchen. He found one thing he could see even with his eyes closed: Nia's laugh when she told him about recess. He held it. Then he found another. The smell of Alana's scrubs when she came home from late shifts, antiseptic and faintly floral. He held that too. And then he found the last thing, the detail that made the decision settle into place. The fact that Rena Wexler had recognized that phrase this morning, had reacted to it like it meant something specific, like it connected to a story Alana had never told him. He opened his eyes and reached for his phone, typing a message to Rena before he could second-guess himself. "I need to see everything you have on my wife." Her response came back in less than a minute. Asterisk, come back to Pratt Street. Now. Asterisk, Tavon called his sister and told her he'd be late again, that something had come up, and when she asked if this was about Alana, he paused long enough that the silence became its own answer. "Yeah," he said finally. "It is." He ended the call and stood in the kitchen for another moment, looking at the parking pass and the calendar and the contents of a life he thought he'd known. Then he grabbed his coat and headed for the door. When he arrived back at the conference room, Rena was waiting with another folder, thicker than the first, and she slid it across the table without preamble. Tavon opened it and found himself staring at a document he'd never seen before, official and formal and devastating in its simplicity. It was a hospital consent form from a Baltimore County facility, dated years before Nia was born, and the name in black ink at the top made his throat close. Alana Jo Rigsby. Under the section marked Donation Authorization was a second line, one that rearranged everything he thought he understood about the woman he'd married. The words sat there, plain and undeniable: bone marrow donation, matched recipient. Tavon sat back in the chair as if the furniture had moved beneath him, his eyes locked on the donation authorization line like it might rearrange itself into something less impossible if he stared long enough. His wife had given bone marrow to someone. His wife had undergone a procedure that required needles and recovery time and physical pain, and she'd never mentioned it once in all the years they'd been together. The document was old enough that the paper had yellowed slightly at the edges, dated from a time before they'd met, before Nia existed, before Alana had become the version of herself that Tavon thought he'd known completely. "I was 16, Rena said, and her voice had gone quieter now, stripped of the professional distance she'd maintained since the train station. "Baltimore County Family Health Center in Catonsville. Leukemia. My mother was choosing between rent and treatment costs, and I was lying in a clinic bed trying to understand why my body had decided to kill me before I'd even figured out who I was supposed to become." She reached across the table and turned the document so she could see it right side up, her fingers tracing the signature line where Alana's name sat in careful handwriting. "Your wife walked into my room wearing scrubs that didn't fit right. Carrying a clipboard, she kept checking like she was afraid she'd forget something important," Rena continued, and the memory seemed to soften her face in a way the corporate composure never had. "She told me the donor match had come through, that someone had volunteered, and then she sat down on the edge of my bed and said the thing you whispered to me this morning. Count the light, not the noise. One thing you can see. Hold it. Then the next." Tavon felt his chest tighten because he remembered Alana coming home some nights with that particular kind of exhaustion that came from carrying other people's fear, the way she'd wash her hands longer than necessary and stare out the kitchen window like she was trying to leave something behind before she came fully into the house. He'd called it work stress. He'd called it the weight of the ICU. Now it looked like evidence of a hidden life built on private decency, the kind that doesn't ask for recognition and doesn't expect gratitude. "She never told me it was her," Rena said. "The donation was anonymous through the registry. I didn't know her name until 2 weeks ago when I started digging through old compliance files and found a memo that shouldn't exist." She pulled another sheet from the folder, this one marked with a red sealed stamp across the top and dated from just 3 months ago. The memo was brief, clinical in its language, but the content made Tavon's hands go cold. It referenced an internal audit of Harborline shipping routes through and Arundel County, specifically routes connected to a medical waste disposal contract that had been flagged for irregularities. And at the bottom of the page, in a section labeled Potential Witness Concerns, was a single line: Alana Rigsby, RN, St. Agnes Hospital, prior knowledge of facility protocols, possible exposure to documentation. Tavon read it twice, trying to make the words connect to something that made sense, but every pathway his mind followed led to the same dark conclusion. She saw something, he said, and it wasn't a question. Rena nodded slowly. Medical waste disposal routes intersect with hospital staff in ways most people never think about, she said. If someone was moving things they shouldn't, pharmaceuticals, biological materials, equipment that wasn't being tracked properly, a nurse who paid attention would notice. Especially a nurse who worked ICU and knew what belonged in those containers and what didn't. Tavon remembered Alana mentioning waste protocols once, complaining about how the hospital had changed contractors and the new people didn't follow proper procedures. He'd thought it was just the kind of workplace frustration everyone dealt with, the bureaucratic annoyances that made jobs harder without making them interesting. Now it felt like a warning he'd missed. The memo was sealed 3 weeks before your wife died, Rena said, and she delivered the timeline like someone presenting evidence in a courtroom, factual and devastating. Harborline's board authorized a full route restructuring 2 weeks after the accident. The medical waste contract was transferred to a different company. All documentation from the previous arrangement was classified as proprietary, and the internal audit was closed without findings. Tavon's throat tightened because he understood what she was implying without her having to say it directly. Alana had become inconvenient. Alana had known something that threatened someone's money. And then Alana had died on a wet stretch of Interstate 95 in a crash that had been ruled driver fatigue and closed within 48 hours. He thought about the funeral, about the police officer who'd handed him Alana's belongings in a plastic bag and told him how sorry he was for his loss, about the way the crash report had been brief and final, and completely incurious about why a nurse who'd worked a 12-hour shift would choose to drive home on the highway instead of the usual route through residential streets. He'd accepted it because grief makes you accept things, because questioning an accident feels like refusing to let someone rest. Now acceptance felt like complicity. They killed her, Tavon said, and the words came out flat and cold because saying them any other way would have broken something in his chest that he couldn't afford to break, while Nia still needed him functional. Rena didn't confirm it. She didn't deny it either. Instead, she said, I can't prove it. The crash report is clean, the investigation was closed, and everyone involved followed procedure exactly the way they're supposed to when they want something to disappear quietly. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a weight that felt personal rather than strategic. But I can tell you that the same security director who called my collapse dizziness this morning before anyone assessed me was copied on the memo about your wife. And I can tell you that the board meeting where they voted to remove me included a proposal to finalize a merger with a defense contractor that would move Harborline's freight operations into Howard County, away from oversight, away from questions, away from anyone who might remember what the old routes looked like. Tavon stood up from the table because sitting still had become physically impossible, and he walked to the window overlooking Pratt Street, watching cars move through the evening traffic like the world was still ordinary. Behind him, he heard Rena gathering the documents, organizing them back into the folder with the kind of precision that suggested she'd done this before, that she knew how to turn grief and suspicion into something structured enough to carry forward. There's a donor gala tomorrow night, she said. Montgomery County, Bethesda, foundation event, board members, contractors, the people who decide narratives before they happen. I'm supposed to attend and smile and pretend I don't know they engineered my removal. And I need someone to walk in there with me who they can't categorize, someone who disrupts the script just by existing in the room. Tavon turned back to face her, and he saw in her expression the same thing he'd felt when he opened Alana's nursing bag and found evidence of a life he hadn't known existed. The understanding that some questions can't be left unanswered, even when the answers cost everything. You want a witness, he said. Rena met his eyes without flinching. I want someone who understands that the whisper your wife taught me 16 years ago is the only reason I'm still alive to fight back, she said. And I think your wife didn't die in a random accident, Tavon. I think she became inconvenient to people who are very good at making inconvenient things disappear. Tavon stood at the window long enough that the silence between them stopped feeling uncomfortable and started feeling like a shared understanding of how much a single decision could cost. His phone sat in his pocket like a weight, and he knew that if he pulled it out right now, there would be another message from Nia, probably asking about bedtime or whether she could have the strawberry yogurt for breakfast or some other small question that assumed her father's world was stable enough to care about yogurt flavors. The problem was that his world had stopped being stable the moment Rena showed him a sealed memo with his wife's name on it, and pretending otherwise felt like the kind of lie that would eventually hurt his daughter more than the truth ever could. The gala is tomorrow night, Rena said again, not pushing but clarifying, giving him the timeline he needed to make a real choice instead of an emotional one. Montgomery County. Bethesda. Black tie, foundation donors. The kind of event where everyone performs concern about causes they'll forget by Monday. Tavon turned back to face her, and he could see that she understood what she was asking. Not for his time or his presence, but for him to step away from the routine that had kept him and Nia functional for 16 months, to break the pattern that protected them both from the reality that grief doesn't actually heal. It just learns to wait quietly until you give it permission to speak again. I need to make a call, he said, and Rena nodded without asking who he was calling because she already knew the answer. He stepped into the hallway and dialed his sister, and when she picked up on the second ring, he could hear Nia's voice in the background asking if it was Dad and could she talk to him. Hey, he said, keeping his voice level. I need you to keep Nia tomorrow night. Late pickup, maybe not until Sunday morning, depending on how things go. The silence on the other end stretched long enough that Tavon knew his sister was calculating what this meant, how far outside his normal behavior this request landed. You never do this, she said finally, and her tone wasn't accusatory but careful, the way someone sounds when they're trying to understand a situation without making it worse by asking the wrong questions. What's going on? Tavon closed his eyes and leaned against the hallway wall, feeling the cool surface press against his shoulders. I need to know something, he said. Tonight. Tomorrow. I'll explain after, but I need to know it now, and I can't do that if I'm worried about pickup schedules. Another pause, and then his sister's voice came back quieter. This about Alana? Tavon's throat tightened because hearing someone else say her name in that tone, concerned, protective, already bracing for bad news, made it real in a way the sealed memo hadn't. Yeah, he said. It is. His sister didn't argue. She didn't ask for details or try to talk him out of whatever he was planning. She just said, okay. But Tavon, if you're doing something that puts you at risk, I need you to think about what that means for Nia. He opened his eyes and stared at the beige wall across from him, at the framed print of the Inner Harbor that probably hung in every corporate conference room in Baltimore. I am thinking about her, he said. That's why I'm doing this. He ended the call before she could respond, before the weight of his own words could settle into something he'd have to defend, and when he walked back into the room, Rena was standing by the table with her arms crossed, waiting. She said yes. Rena asked, and Tavon nodded once. Good, Rena said, because I need you to understand what we're walking into before you commit. She sat back down and folded her hands on the table, and when she spoke again, her voice had shifted into the tone of someone explaining rules to a game neither of them had agreed to play. The gala isn't about charity, she said. It's a coordination point. Board members, contractors, foundation administrators, people who need to be in the same room without it looking like a strategy meeting. They'll smile and drink expensive wine and talk about causes, but what they're really doing is confirming narratives, aligning stories, making sure everyone knows which version of events we're all supposed to believe. Tavon sat down across from her and said, and you want me there because I'm uncategorizable. Rena's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. I want you there because when you walk into a room like that with me, they can't figure out how to frame it. Are you my lawyer? My consultant? My security? They'll spend the whole night trying to place you. And while they're doing that, they'll make mistakes. They'll say things they wouldn't say if they knew exactly who you were. Tavon understood then that this wasn't about protection or companionship. It was about disruption, about introducing an element into a controlled environment that forced people to break their scripts. You don't need a shield, he said. You need a witness. Rena met his eyes without hesitation. I need someone who won't look away when they say something that matters, she said. Someone who understands that these people don't threaten you directly. They just create conditions where bad things happen to people who ask too many questions. Tavon's phone buzzed on the table between them, and this time when he looked at the screen, the message wasn't a question about pickup or yogurt. It was a photo Nia had sent hours ago that he hadn't opened yet, and when he tapped it, the image expanded to show her spelling test with a red star at the top, and her name written too large in the corner where it said student. Beneath the photo was a caption in her careful typing, "I want pizza tonight." The ordinariness of it hit him like a physical force, his daughter proud of her spelling, thinking about dinner, existing in a world where the biggest concern was whether they'd have pepperoni or cheese. That world was the one Tavon had been trying to preserve by maintaining routine, by not asking questions about crash reports or sealed memos, by accepting that some things were just tragic accidents, because believing otherwise meant acknowledging that danger could be deliberate and targeted and patient. But looking at Nia's photo now, he understood that preservation through ignorance wasn't protection. It was just a slower way of losing. He set the phone down and looked at Rena. "If I walk into that gala tomorrow night," he said, "I'm leaving my daughter's normal evening in someone else's hands so I can stand in a room full of people who might have killed my wife." Rena didn't flinch from the weight of that statement. "And if you don't," she said quietly, "you'll spend the rest of your life wondering whether Alana died because she saw something she shouldn't have." The air in the room settled into the kind of silence that comes after a decision has already been made, but before anyone said it out loud. Tavon felt it settle in his chest, heavy and certain, and when he spoke again, his voice was steady. "What time should I be ready?" Rena's expression shifted, not relief exactly, but recognition that they'd crossed into territory where turning back stopped being an option. 6:30, she said. "I'll send a car." Then she reached into her folder one more time and pulled out a document that made Tavon's hands go still on the table. It was a crash report addendum, stamped with Baltimore County letterhead, and Rena slid it toward him with careful precision. "There's something else you need to see before tomorrow," she said. "Something they never showed you." Tavon stared at the crash report addendum for a long time before he touched it, as if the paper itself might rearrange the last 16 months into something he couldn't survive. The document was brief, 2 paragraphs, single-spaced, stamped with Baltimore County Traffic Investigation Unit letterhead, and there was a highlighted section near the bottom that made his vision narrow until the rest of the room disappeared. Witness statement from adjacent lane indicates unidentified vehicle observed pacing subject vehicle approximately 2 miles prior to impact. Dark sedan, no plates visible, maintained consistent distance before departing scene immediately post-collision. Unable to locate for follow-up. Tavon's hands started shaking before his brain caught up to what he was reading. The official report he'd been given at the funeral had said single-car accident, driver fatigue, vehicle drifted over center line on wet pavement. It had been 2 pages long and definitive in its conclusions. This addendum was 3 paragraphs that never made it into the file they'd shown him, 3 paragraphs that turned an accident into something with intention behind it. "Why wasn't I given this?" he asked, and his voice came out rough because anger was easier than grief and both were fighting for space in his chest. Rena's expression stayed controlled, but he could see something shift behind her eyes, the recognition that they'd moved past corporate conspiracy into the kind of personal violation that doesn't forgive easily. "Because addendums like this get filed separately when investigations are closed quickly," she said. "They're technically part of the record, but unless you know to ask for supplemental documentation, they don't get included in the family notification packet. It's not illegal. It's just designed to keep things simple." Tavon heard what she wasn't saying directly. That simple meant convenient. That convenient meant closed. That closed meant no one had to answer questions about why a witness saw a vehicle pacing his wife before she died, and that detail somehow didn't matter enough to slow down the conclusion. He thought back to the funeral, to the week after when he'd been moving through each day like he was underwater, and he remembered something he'd dismissed at the time as grief, making him paranoid. A man in a dark suit had approached him at the service, someone he didn't recognize, and had offered condolences that felt rehearsed, like he was reading from a script he'd memorized. The man had said something about how these things happen, how fatigue catches up to healthcare workers, how Alana had been a credit to her profession. Tavon had nodded and accepted the words because he hadn't had the capacity to question them, But now he remembered the man's hands. Clean, manicured, not the hands of someone who'd known Alana personally. Someone came to the funeral who shouldn't have been there, Tavon said, and the memory sharpened as he spoke it out loud. He knew she was a nurse. He knew details about her schedule, but he wasn't from the hospital. Rena leaned forward slightly, her attention focused in a way that suggested she understood the significance of that detail. Did he give you a card? A name? Tavon shook his head. He just said he was sorry for my loss and that he hoped the investigation had brought closure. The word investigation echoed in his head now, because why would someone at a funeral reference an investigation unless they needed to know whether Tavon had accepted the official narrative or was planning to push back? Rena pulled out her phone and scrolled through something, then turned the screen toward him. The image showed a corporate headshot, professional and unremarkable, and Tavon's stomach dropped when he recognized the face. That's him, he said. Who is he? Rena's mouth tightened into a line. Marcus Howell, Harborline's director of security. The same man who called my collapsed dizziness before anyone assessed me. The room felt smaller suddenly, like the walls had moved closer while they were talking, and Tavon understood with cold clarity that this wasn't a theory anymore. It was a pattern. Rena set her phone down and said, "They don't threaten you directly. They don't send explicit warnings. They just make sure you understand that asking questions is harder than accepting answers, and then they wait to see if you're the kind of person who chooses the harder path." Tavon looked at the addendum again, at the highlighted section that described a vehicle pacing his wife before she died, and he felt something settle in his chest that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief, but lived somewhere between them. "How do we do this tomorrow?" he asked, because he'd already made the decision to walk into that gala, and now he needed to know how to survive it. Rena pulled the folder back toward her and opened it to a page that showed a floor plan of the event space in Bethesda, marked with handwritten notes about sight lines and exit routes. "We stay visible, but not central," she said. "We position ourselves where we can see who's talking to whom, who avoids eye contact, who changes their body language when they notice us. And we listen for specific phrases, anything about route changes, compliance reviews, or operational restructuring. Those are the words people use when they think they're being careful." Tavon studied the floor plan and saw that she'd marked 3 positions along the perimeter of the main ballroom, each one offering a clear view of different sections of the room. "You've done this before," he said, and it wasn't a question. Rena's expression flickered with something that might have been old pain. "I spent 15 years learning how to read rooms where everyone's performing a version of themselves," she said. "The trick is watching for the moments when the performance breaks, when someone forgets to maintain their face because they think no one important is looking." She traced a line on the floor plan from the entrance to a side hallway marked staff access. "This is where they'll have private conversations they think are secure. If we can position ourselves near the transition point, we'll hear pieces without being obvious about listening." Tavon nodded, committing the layout to memory, and then asked the question that had been building since she showed him the addendum. "Who wrote this? Who decided that a witness seeing a vehicle pacing my wife wasn't important enough to investigate?" Rena closed the folder and met his eyes. "That's what we're going to find out tomorrow," she said. "Because someone in that room tomorrow night knows the answer, and when they see us together, they're going to make a choice about whether we're a problem they can ignore or a problem they need to manage." The weight of that statement settled between them like a third presence in the room, and Tavon felt his phone buzz again in his pocket, but didn't reach for it, because he knew it would be Nia asking something ordinary, and he couldn't afford to think about ordinary right now without losing his nerve. "What time tomorrow?" he asked again, and Rena checked her watch. 6:30. "The car will pick you up wherever you are." She stood and gathered her materials, and Tavon noticed that her hands were steady now in a way they hadn't been at the train station, like having a plan had restored some structure to her world. They walked out of the conference room together, and when they reached the building's front entrance, Rena paused and looked at him with an expression that felt more human than strategic. "Thank you," she said, and the words came out simple, without the corporate polish she'd maintained through most of their conversation. "For believing me when you didn't have to." Tavon thought about the addendum in his pocket, about the parking pass from Catonsville, about the donation form with Alana's signature, and he realized that belief wasn't optional anymore. The evidence had made it mandatory. "I'll see you tomorrow," he said, and stepped out into the evening air. The drive back to Towson felt longer than it should have, and when he finally pulled into his driveway, he sat in the car for several minutes before going inside, trying to prepare himself for the performance of normalcy he'd have to maintain for Nia. The next evening arrived faster than he wanted it to, and when the car pulled up outside his sister's house at exactly 6:30, Tavon was wearing a suit he'd borrowed and shoes that pinched slightly because he'd bought them for a funeral and hadn't worn them since. The drive to Bethesda took 40 minutes, and when they arrived at the venue, a converted estate with columns and valet parking and the kind of lighting that made everything look softer than it was, Tavon felt his chest tighten with the understanding that he was about to walk into a room full of people who performed concern for a living. Rena was waiting at the entrance, and when she saw him, something in her posture relaxed fractionally. They walked in together, and Tavon scanned the crowd out of habit, looking for threats the way he'd learned to do after Alana died. And then he saw him, Marcus Howell, Harborline's security director, standing near the bar with a drink in his hand, watching the entrance like he'd been expecting them. The ballroom was designed to make wealth look effortless. All high ceilings and crystal chandeliers, and servers moving through the crowd with trays of champagne that cost more per glass than Tavon spent on groceries in a week. He walked in beside Rena wearing a borrowed suit that fit well enough to pass inspection, but not well enough to make him feel like he belonged. And he could see the way people's eyes tracked them, brief assessments, quick categorizations, the mental filing that happens when someone enters a room, and everyone needs to decide whether they matter. Tavon had learned a long time ago how to hold himself steady in spaces that didn't want him, how to meet eyes without challenging, and how to occupy space without apologizing for it. But this was different because everyone here performed concern professionally, and he was trying to read the performance for cracks. Rena moved through the room with the kind of practiced ease that came from years of attending events like this, pausing to greet donors and foundation board members with smiles that looked genuine until you noticed they never reached her eyes. Tavon stayed close enough to signal they were together, but far enough back to observe without being obvious, and he watched the way people reacted to Rena's presence, some leaning in with exaggerated warmth, others finding sudden reasons to check their phones or refresh their drinks. The avoidance was polite but unmistakable, the social equivalent of crossing to the other side of the street, and Tavon understood that these were the people who'd already decided which narrative they were supporting. A woman in a navy dress approached them near the auction display, her smile bright and her handshake firm, and she told Rena how wonderful it was to see her looking so well after the incident. The phrasing was careful, sanitized, and Tavon noticed how she didn't specify which incident she meant, leaving room for Rena to fill in the blank with whatever version felt safest. Rena introduced Tavon without explaining who he was, just his name and a gesture that suggested they were here together, and the woman's smile flickered for half a second while she tried to place him in a category that made sense. When she couldn't, she excused herself with practiced grace and moved toward a group near the bar. Tavon watched her go and said quietly, "She's going to tell someone." Rena nodded without looking at him. "That's the point," she said. "Confusion makes people check in with authority. And when they check in, they reveal who they report to." They separated briefly after that, Rena drifting toward a cluster of board members while Tavon positioned himself near the edge of the room where he could see the staff hallway entrance. He felt exposed standing alone, the only black man in a suit that didn't quite fit in a room full of people who'd learned how to wear wealth like a second skin, and he could feel the polite isolation starting. People giving him space that felt less like courtesy and more like containment. A server approached with champagne, and Tavon took a glass he had no intention of drinking just to have something to do with his hands. That's when he heard it, a name spoken casually across the room, just loud enough to carry over the ambient conversation. Rigsby handled the St. Agnes protocols before the contractor change. The voice belonged to a man in his 50s standing near the auction table, talking to someone Tavon couldn't see clearly through the crowd. The man continued, oblivious to being overheard. "Clean documentation, no flags. Made the transition easier when we needed it quiet." Tavon's hands tightened around the champagne glass hard enough that he worried it might shatter. Rigsby, his wife's name, spoken like a procedural detail, like evidence of something managed successfully. He forced himself to stay still, to not react visibly, and he felt his breathing start to shallow the way it did when panic was building. Then Rena was beside him, materializing from the crowd with perfect timing, and she noticed immediately the way his shoulders had gone rigid. She didn't ask if he was okay. She already knew he wasn't. Instead, she reached up and adjusted his collar with the kind of casual intimacy that suggested they'd known each other longer than 2 days, and she said quietly, "You look like you belong here more than half these people do." Her voice was steady, grounding, and then she added something that surprised him. "Your wife made me laugh once when I was 16 and terrified. She told me a terrible joke about hospital food that wasn't funny at all, but I laughed anyway, because she said it like laughter was a choice I still got to make." Tavon almost smiled despite everything, and the tension in his chest loosened fractionally. The moment broke when he heard the voice again, closer now, and he turned toward it instinctively. The man who'd spoken was moving toward the staff hallway, still talking to his companion, and Tavon caught another fragment. "Route code A7 needs final authorization before the Montgomery filing." Rena's hand touched his arm briefly, a signal to wait, but Tavon was already moving. He set the champagne glass on a passing tray and followed the voice toward the hallway entrance, keeping his pace casual, his body language neutral, like he was just looking for the restroom or a quieter space to take a call. The hallway was dimmer than the ballroom, lined with photographs of Foundation events from previous years, and at the end near what looked like a service entrance, Tavon saw the man stop to retrieve something from a side table. It was a folder, plain manila but marked with a label visible even from a distance. Route code AA7 and Arundel Medical Logistics. The man tucked it under his arm and disappeared through the service entrance, and Tavon stood in the hallway feeling his heart pound against his ribs because A7 wasn't just a route code. It was the county where Alana had died. He pulled out his phone with shaking hands and texted Rena. Found something. Staff hallway. Need you. She appeared less than a minute later, her expression controlled but her eyes sharp with focus. "What did you see?" she asked, keeping her voice low. Tavon told her about the folder, about the route code, about the way the man had said Rigsby like it was a completed task instead of a person, and he watched Rena's face go still in the way it did when she was processing information that confirmed something she'd suspected but hadn't wanted to believe. "We need to follow him," she said. But before they could move, the service door opened again and Marcus Howell stepped through, his eyes landing on them with the kind of recognition that suggested he'd been expecting this exact scenario. "Mr. Rigsby," Howell said, his voice polite and controlled. "I was hoping we'd have a chance to talk." Howell stood in the hallway with his hands loose at his sides, his expression arranged into something that might have passed for concern if Tavon hadn't seen him perform the same careful sympathy at Alana's funeral. "This isn't the place for this conversation," Howell said, his tone measured. "But since you're here, maybe we should clear up some misunderstandings before they become problems." Tavon felt his jaw tighten at the word misunderstandings, like Alana's death was a clerical error. "My wife's name was in your compliance files," he said, keeping his voice level. "That's not a misunderstanding. That's documentation." Howell's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. "Your wife was a good nurse. She filed a concern about waste disposal protocols at St. Agnes. Standard procedure. We investigated, found no violations, closed the matter." The explanation was smooth, practiced, and Tavon recognized it as the kind of answer that sounds complete until you realize it hasn't addressed the question. "Then why seal the file?" Rena asked. "Standard investigations don't get sealed. They get resolved and archived." Howell turned to her, and Tavon saw him recalculate, realizing she understood the systems he was using. "Sometimes files get sealed to protect proprietary business processes. Your board made a decision this week based on performance metrics. What happened at the station was unfortunate, but it doesn't change fundamentals." Rena's laugh came out sharp. "You called it dizziness before the paramedic assessed me. That's script adherence." Howell didn't deny it. Words matter in crisis management. We choose them carefully. The admission hung in the hallway, and before anyone could respond, voices drifted through the service entrance door. Tavon recognized one as the man who'd carried the AA7 folder. The conversation was muffled but distinct. "Audit exposure minimal if we maintain the current narrative." And "clean exits for personnel who documented irregularities." Tavon's hands went cold because clean exits was the kind of language that sounded bureaucratic until you applied it to someone who died in a car accident 16 months ago. Howell noticed his reaction. You should go back to the gala, Mr. Rigsby. Take your daughter to dinner tomorrow. Live your life. The suggestion was delivered without menace, which made it worse because it implied that living his life and pursuing the truth were mutually exclusive. Tavon stepped closer. My wife saw something. She filed a report. And then someone decided she was a clean exit. Howell's expression cracked fractionally, calculation showing through. Your wife witnessed a discrepancy in medical waste manifest that could have complicated a contractor transition. She followed protocol and reported it. The investigation found the discrepancy was a documentation error, not a violation. But the timing was sensitive because Harbor Line was negotiating route restructuring through and Arundel County, and any suggestion of impropriety could have delayed regulatory approval. Tavon felt the pieces click together. Alana hadn't discovered corruption. She'd discovered inconvenient timing. She'd been collateral damage in a business decision that couldn't afford delays. So you made sure she couldn't complicate things, Tavon said. Howell didn't confirm it. He just said, accidents happen, Mr. Rigsby, especially to people who work long shifts and drive tired. Subscribe before silence costs someone everything. The hallway felt smaller, and Tavon realized they were standing in the exact kind of space where narratives got written. Dim, private, away from witnesses. Rena's phone buzzed, and she pulled it out, her face going still. Excuse me, she said to Howell. I need to take this. She walked a few steps away, and Tavon watched her shoulders tense as she listened. When she came back, her expression had shifted into something guarded. That was Elliot Vance, she said, naming a board member. He wants to meet. Privately. Now, Howell's face showed nothing, but his weight shifted. That's your choice, Ms. Wexler. But Mr. Rigsby should probably wait here. Some conversations are better handled one-on-one. Rena looked at Tavon, weighing whether splitting up was strategic or dangerous. I'll be fine, she said, though he wasn't sure if she was trying to convince him or herself. She walked toward the ballroom, and Howell smiled faintly at Tavon. You care about her. That's admirable. But caring doesn't change facts. It just makes them harder to accept. Tavon turned and walked back into the ballroom, scanning for Rena, and saw her disappearing through a side door with a silver-haired man in an expensive suit. The door closed behind them, and Tavon felt the night shift into something new, something that required him to decide whether he trusted Rena to handle herself or whether leaving her alone with a board member was the kind of mistake that turned witnesses into clean exits. The side door opened and Rena emerged pale, her hands steady but her eyes carrying shock. She walked straight to Tavon. They offered me a settlement, she said quietly. Full severance, non-disclosure agreement, reference letter that makes it look like I resigned for personal reasons. Her shoulders were tight. I almost said yes. Standing in that room, with Vance explaining how clean this could be, my body remembered the station. The collapse. How easy it would be to just let go again. Tavon understood. Trauma creates shortcuts in the brain, pathways that make surrender feel like relief instead of defeat. Count the light, he said quietly. Not the noise. Rena's eyes met his, shifting from panic to recognition. One thing you can see. Hold it. Then the next. She inhaled slowly. I can see you. Standing here when you could have walked away. Her breathing evened out. And I can see that folder with the AA7 route code. Evidence exists. Tavon felt something shift between them. Not romance, but recognition. Two people who'd both learned that grief doesn't heal through forgetting. It heals through choosing to see what hurts. We need someone who can validate the evidence, he said. Rena nodded. Maryland State Transportation Authority has an independent inspector general. Federal jurisdiction over interstate freight routes. If we get the route documentation and crash addendum to them together, they'd have to open an inquiry. It wasn't revenge. It was making the narrative harder to control. His phone rang. Nia's name appeared, and his chest tightened because she knew not to call unless important. He answered calmly. Hey, baby. Everything okay? Her voice came through small and uncertain. Dad, something weird happened at pickup today. His hand tightened. What happened? She took a breath. A man talked to Ms. Calhoun after school. Asked if I was Alana's daughter. Said he used to work with Mom at St. Agnes. The floor tilted. What did he look like? Her voice got quieter. I didn't see him good. But Dad, he got Mom's hair color wrong. Told Ms. Calhoun Mom had blonde hair. Ice water through his veins. Alana's hair had been dark brown, almost black. Someone who actually knew her would never make that mistake. Mom didn't have blonde hair, Nia said. And now there was fear in her voice, the kind that comes when a child realizes adults are lying. Tavon forced calm, because if he let Nia hear his panic, it would become hers. You're right, baby. Mom's hair was dark. What did he want? Nia hesitated. Miss Calhoun said he just wanted to say hi because he remembered Mom being nice. But it felt wrong, Dad. Tavon closed his eyes, using the whisper technique on himself, finding one thing he could hold. Nia's voice, still scared but trusting him. Listen to me, he said. You're safe. Aunt Dee's with you right now. Nia confirmed she was. Good. Stay inside tonight. No playing outside. If anyone you don't know tries to talk to you, go straight to Aunt Dee. He could hear her processing instructions that sounded like danger. Okay, she said finally. When are you coming home? Tavon looked at Rena, who'd gone very still beside him. Soon, baby. I promise. He ended the call and felt the night rearrange itself into something sharper because they'd moved from corporate conspiracy to direct family pressure in one phone call. They went after Nia, he said, voice flat. Rena's face had gone pale. They're showing you where to apply pressure, she said. It's what they do when scripts stop working. They don't threaten directly. They just make you aware of vulnerability. Something in Tavon's chest went cold and hard, the part of him that had been trying to be reasonable burning away into protective focus. We're leaving now, he said, going straight to whoever can take the evidence and make it official. Rena nodded and pulled out her phone. I know someone at the Maryland Inspector General's office. If we get there tonight with everything we have, they'd have to open a file. They walked toward the exit together, and Tavon felt eyes tracking them, Howell somewhere calculating. At the valet line, Rena stopped suddenly, her hand on his arm. We can't show up without leverage, she said. If we go empty-handed with just testimony, it's our word against institutional documentation. We need the physical evidence, the folder, route manifests, something they can't deny. Tavon understood, but every second they delayed felt like giving whoever had approached Nia more time to escalate. Then we get it, he said. Where is it? Rena looked back toward the venue, toward the service entrance where the man with the AA-7 folder had disappeared. It's still inside, she said. And so is Howell. They walked back into the venue through a side entrance, and Tavon felt himself shift from father to something colder he didn't have a name for yet. Rena led them toward the service corridor, avoiding the main ballroom. When they reached the hallway where Tavon had seen the AA-7 folder, she checked her phone. Howell left 10 minutes ago, she said. Security's thin back here. We have maybe 5 minutes before someone notices we're not where we're supposed to be. The folder sat on a side table near what looked like an office door. Rena picked it up, photographed each page with her phone, then tucked it back exactly where they'd found it. Route manifests, contractor agreements, memo referencing the St. Agnes audit closure, she said. This is enough. Tavon's phone vibrated in his pocket. His sister, Nia, keeps asking when you're coming home. She's okay, but something's off? He typed back quickly. On my way. Keep doors locked. Don't let anyone in you don't know. The response came fast. What's going on? Tavon didn't answer because explaining would take longer than getting there. They reached the parking garage, and when they got to his car, Rena stopped him. Wait. She scanned the vehicle. Tavon followed her gaze, a fresh scrape along the rear bumper, bright paint transfer that hadn't been there. Rena walked around and lifted the windshield wiper, revealing a folded piece of paper. Are you ready for this? He nodded. She pulled the paper out, read it, and handed it to him. The note was typed, clean, professional. You don't get to call it an accident, Tavon. Fathers don't lose focus when their daughters are counting on them. Tavon read it twice. The structure mirrored the accusation Rena had faced at the train station. Same controlled language, implication that tragedy was actually negligence, same threat wrapped in observation. But this time it wasn't aimed at a CEO's stability. It was aimed at his daughter's safety. They know where I live, Tavon said, voice flat. They know where Nia goes to school. Rena's face had gone pale. We're not going home first. We're going to the Inspector General's office now, with this note, the photographs, and your crash addendum. Then you're taking Nia somewhere they can't find her while the investigation opens. It wasn't a question. Tavon looked at the note again, at his name printed there, and he thought about Nia asking when he was coming home, sleeping with the hallway light on, trusting that her father could keep her safe. He folded the note carefully and put it in his pocket next to the crash addendum. If I do this, they'll come after her harder. Rena met his eyes. And if you don't, they'll keep doing it to other people. Other nurses who see things. Other executives who ask questions. Your wife died trying to do the right thing. Are you going to let that mean nothing? The question settled into a choice that wasn't really a choice. Tavon thought about Alana coming home late, washing her hands too long, staring out the kitchen window like she was carrying something she couldn't put down, teaching a 16-year-old to count the light instead of the noise, giving bone marrow to a stranger, filing a report because it was right even when it was inconvenient. And he thought about Nia, 8 years old, living in a world where her father's choices would teach her whether courage mattered or survival was all that counted. Let's go, he said. Rena got in beside him, and as Tavon started the engine, he caught sight of the note in his pocket once more. Fathers don't lose focus when their daughters are counting on them. They were right. He wouldn't. But focus didn't mean backing down. It meant seeing exactly what they were and making sure everyone else saw it too. He pulled out of the parking garage and headed toward downtown Baltimore, toward the federal building where the Inspector General's office stayed open late, toward the moment when a conspiracy stayed quiet or became public record. In the rearview mirror, the gala venue disappeared, all its performed concern shrinking into distance. Somewhere in that building, Howell was probably getting a call about the missing photographs. Somewhere in Anne Arundel County, someone was waiting to see if Tavon would choose his daughter's immediate safety over long-term justice. But Tavon had already made his choice. He was his wife's husband and his daughter's father, and neither of those things meant running. They meant standing exactly where the cost was highest and refusing to look away. The note proved the script was aimed at him now. Good. Let them write it. He'd make sure everyone could read between the lines.